What happens when a beloved actor from one of the biggest franchises in film history sits down for what should be a lighthearted late-night interview, only to have the entire conversation spiral into one of the most uncomfortable moments in talk show history? The tension was thick, the accusations were flying, and by the end, security was involved. This is the story of how Tom Felton's appearance on The Tonight Show went from playful banter to a full-blown confrontation that left audiences speechless and the entertainment world buzzing for weeks. Before we get into exactly what went down, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me which late-night host you think handles controversial guests the best. Because after you hear this story, you'll have a whole new perspective on live television. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon has always been known for its upbeat energy. It's the kind of show where celebrities come on, laugh at themselves, promote a project, and leave without a scratch. That's exactly what everyone expected when Tom Felton walked onto the stage. Best known to millions as Draco Malfoy from the Harry Potter films, Tom was greeted with thunderous applause. Jimmy grinned, clapped along, and welcomed him like an old friend. From the outside, it looked like another safe, nostalgic interview was about to unfold. The first few minutes followed the familiar script. They talked about Tom's recent work, his life in England, and the legacy of Harry Potter. Jimmy pulled up an old photo of Tom in Slytherin robes, barely a teenager, and the audience reacted with warm laughter and cheers. Tom smiled, clearly used to this moment. It was the same image, the same memory, the same conversation he'd had hundreds of times before. Then Jimmy leaned forward with that playful tone viewers know so well and asked what sounded like a harmless question, playing the villain for so many years. Did any of that ever rub off on you in real life? Were you ever tempted to be a bit of Draco off camera? It was meant to be a joke, the kind of question designed to get a quick laugh and an easy answer. But something shifted. Tom paused. His smile faded just enough for people to notice. Instead of laughing it off, he turned the question back on Jimmy. Do you really think playing a character makes someone that character? The audience laughed nervously, unsure if this was still part of the bit. Jimmy tried to brush it aside, but Tom didn't let it go. He explained, calmly at first, that he'd been asked some version of that question for nearly 20 years, that it always carried the same implication, that because he played someone cruel on screen, people assumed it said something about who he was off screen. The room started to quiet. This wasn't nostalgia anymore. This was frustration, raw and unresolved. Jimmy attempted to steer things back to safe ground, praising how iconic Draco was and how much fans loved the character. But Tom leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as the weight of the moment settled over the studio. He explained that for 2 decades he'd worked relentlessly to move beyond one role, taking on independent films, theater work, and projects that challenged him creatively. Yet every interview, every appearance, always circled back to the same character he played as a child. He wasn't angry at the fans, he said, but at the system that refused to see him as anything more. His voice stayed controlled, but the edge was unmistakable. Jimmy tried to lighten the mood, pointing out that playing such an iconic character was a compliment, proof of how memorable Tom's performance was. But Tom pushed back again, asking why that compliment always felt like a ceiling instead of a foundation. He pointed out that other actors who played villains weren't constantly asked if they were secretly cruel in real life. Why him? Why was he still being framed by a role from decades ago? That question landed hard. Jimmy's smile tightened as he shuffled his cue cards, clearly trying to regain control. He suggested Tom might be reading too much into a simple joke, emphasizing that the show was meant to be fun. But Tom disagreed, saying it didn't feel fun to be reduced to a stereotype on one of the biggest platforms in entertainment. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to clap, laugh, or stay silent. Jimmy offered a brief apology and attempted to pivot to Tom's latest project, hoping to reset the conversation. For a moment, it seemed like Tom might accept it. Instead, he called out what he saw as the real issue, apologizing just to move on without actually listening. He accused Jimmy of wanting him to smile for the camera and play along rather than express anything honest. The tension escalated quickly. Jimmy defended himself, saying Tom was bringing personal frustrations into a lighthearted interview. Tom countered that the frustration existed precisely because moments like this kept repeating. He described being typecast, overlooked, and treated like he was permanently stuck in character. The word harmless came up again, and Tom rejected it outright, listing how those assumptions had affected his career and his life. At this point, the audience's discomfort was impossible to ignore. Some nodded along with Tom, others shifted uneasily in their seats. Jimmy's tone hardened as he reminded Tom that this was a comedy show, not a deep-dive discussion on industry problems. If Tom wanted that kind of conversation, maybe this wasn't the place. That comment changed everything. Tom took it as being told to know his place, to stay in his lane, to play the role expected of him both on screen and off. Voices rose. The exchange stopped sounding like banter and started sounding like a genuine argument between two people who felt misunderstood. Jimmy pushed back, saying Tom was turning one question into a personal attack. Tom accused Jimmy of being part of a larger machine that the atmosphere had shifted so completely that it no longer felt like a television show. It felt like a private argument unfolding in front of millions. Jimmy stood his ground, reminding Tom that he didn't control casting decisions or the industry at large. He said audiences remembered Draco because it was a massive cultural moment, not because anyone was trying to trap Tom in the past. From Jimmy's perspective, that was simply the reality of fame. Tom rejected that explanation outright. He said reality didn't have to stay frozen, that people with platforms had the power to shape narratives whether they admitted it or not. He pointed out that every joke, every framing of a question, reinforced public perception. And when someone like Jimmy, with one of the biggest stages in late-night television, leaned into those shortcuts, it sent a message that this was all he'd ever be. Jimmy's patience wore thin. He argued that his job was to entertain, not to dissect careers or challenge audiences with uncomfortable truths. He said the show was meant to give people relief, not confrontation. Tom replied that maybe constant relief was the problem, that audiences had grown used to surface-level conversations, because no one was willing to go deeper. That exchange drew an audible reaction from the crowd. Gasps rippled through the studio as Jimmy finally stood up from behind his desk. The movement alone signaled that something had gone seriously wrong. Hosts didn't do that unless they were ending a segment or escalating a situation. Jimmy said firmly that the interview was over and that it was time to move on. Tom stood up as well, clearly stunned but not backing down. He accused Jimmy of shutting down the moment things became real. Jimmy responded that Tom had turned the interview hostile, insulting him and the show in the process. He said it wasn't fair to unload years of frustration onto one late-night conversation. The argument intensified. Tom insisted he wasn't attacking anyone, just telling the truth about how these moments felt. Jimmy said truth was subjective, that Tom wasn't the only one with valid experiences. The two men stood facing each other, the desk between them feeling suddenly very small. When Jimmy told Tom to leave, the words hit the room like a shockwave. There was no joke, no smile, no attempt to soften it, just a direct command. Tom stared at him, as if waiting for him to reconsider. When he didn't, Tom said he would go, but not without making his point clear. He turned to the audience, telling them this was what happened when someone refused to play along. He said challenging the system came with consequences, and they were watching those consequences unfold in real time. A few hesitant claps broke out, quickly swallowed by silence. Jimmy gestured off stage and warned that security would get involved if Tom didn't leave. That warning alone sent another ripple of discomfort through the crowd. Tom laughed bitterly. The sight of security guards stepping onto the stage made everything feel surreal. This wasn't a sketch. This wasn't a bit. Tom raised his hand slightly, signaling that he wasn't going to resist. But his voice remained steady. He said this was exactly what he'd been talking about. When the conversation stopped being convenient, the solution wasn't dialogue, it was removal. The guards stood close, professional and quiet, waiting for him to move. Tom took one last look at Jimmy, then turned toward the audience. He told them to remember what they were seeing, to remember how quickly honesty became a problem. He said he came on the show hoping to talk about his work, about growth, about who he'd become since Harry Potter. Instead, he'd been pushed back into the same box he'd been fighting for years. A few people clapped again, unsure but clearly moved. Others sat frozen, conflicted. As Tom walked toward the exit with security beside him, Jimmy remained center stage, visibly shaken. Just before leaving, Tom turned back one final time. He said the saddest part wasn't being asked to leave. It was realizing that someone he respected was no different from the rest, that nothing would change as long as uncomfortable conversations were treated like threats. Jimmy responded quietly but firmly, saying Tom needed to take responsibility for his own career and choices. That burning bridges wouldn't fix anything. Tom accepted that. He said he chose to speak up and would live with the consequences. But at least he'd been honest. Then he walked off the stage. The studio fell into a heavy silence that lingered long after he disappeared backstage. Slowly, scattered applause filled the room, not overwhelming, but real. Others stayed silent, clearly siding with Jimmy or unsure what to think. Jimmy returned to his desk, rubbed his face, and forced a smile toward the camera. He acknowledged the moment as unexpected and quickly threw to a commercial break. The band played, but the usual energy was gone. Backstage, producers scrambled. Phones lit up, and clips were already spreading online. In the days that followed, the debate exploded. Some praised Tom for calling out typecasting and superficial interviews. Others criticized him for choosing the wrong venue and blindsiding a host known for comedy. Jimmy addressed it briefly on a later show, wishing Tom well without revisiting details. Tom posted a short message online about the importance of uncomfortable conversations. Neither backed down. The industry reacted, the audience debated, and the clip lived on. Whether anything truly changed remained unclear. But one thing was certain. For a few unforgettable minutes, the mask slipped, the script broke, and live television became uncomfortably real.